Good afternoon, generals, and welcome once again to our series Men Around the Führer. Our story begins far from the roaring crowds and the imposing edifices of the Third Reich on the eastern edge of Europe, in a town then known as Reval, now Tallinn, Estonia. Here, on the 12th of January in 1893, was born Alfred Ernst Rosenberg, a man whose life would be tragically interwoven with the most destructive ideology of the modern age. He was a Baltic German, born to a wealthy family, the son of an Estonian mother and a Lithuanian father, both of Baltic German extraction. Yet, despite this lineage, or perhaps because of the psychological complexities it engendered, he carried an enduring intense sense of Germanity, common among expatriate Germans living in the border regions. Ironically, given the fanatical racial purity he would later preach, his name, Rosenberg, was one that in Germany was often associated with Jewish origins, though it was a common Gentile name in the Baltic region. He himself was accused by one journalist of having no drop of German blood. The early years of young Alfred were defined by the pursuit of technical knowledge and art. He attended the Petri Realschule, a school emphasizing practical subjects rather than humanities, which only granted him access to a technical university. From 1910 to 1915, he studied engineering at the Riga Polytechnical Institute, and then, as the war approached Riga, the entire school evacuated, and he continued his education in architecture at the Moscow Imperial Higher Technical School, receiving his diploma in 1918, shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution. His early passion lay in configuration, in the architect's art, where structures and systems are meticulously brought into closed form. This innate gift for shaping thoughts into precise formulations, observed even from his youth, would later lend an astonishing certainty and maturity to his ideological writings. But the intellectual curiosity of Rosenberg was vast. Beyond his formal studies, he immersed himself in philosophy, deeply reading Kant and Schopenhauer, and diving into Indian philosophy, religious literature, and the classical histories of Greece and Rome. He also cultivated a love for classical music and literary matters. Yet, for all this voracious study, he remained throughout his life, as one observer noted, a deeply half-educated man, often more interested in converting knowledge into abstract theory than in objective research. The crucial turning point, the searing experience that molded the future ideologue, was the Russian Revolution of 1917. He took his final architecture exams in November and December of 1917 and had the opportunity to observe the revolution unfold. For Rosenberg, the disintegration of the vast Russian Empire seemed inexplicable through ordinary means, and he readily accepted the facile explanations circulating among the German-speaking expatriates in Reval. The chaos must be the work of nefarious international conspiracies. Already an anti-Bolshevik and anti-Semite, he fled the revolution-torn land in late 1918, eventually finding his way to Munich, Germany, in January 1919. In the turbulent ultra-nationalist Munich of the immediate post-war era, Rosenberg found his destiny. He joined the precursor to the Nazi Party, the German Workers' Party, DAP, in early 1919, making him an earlier member than Adolf Hitler himself. His initial political steps began with a public lecture on the Jewish problem on November 30, 1918. He carried with him his vivid, distorted impressions of Russia's collapse, which he was prepared to sell to the right-wing movement. It was a stroke of fortune, a lucky star, that guided him to the influential circles gathered around Dietrich Eckart. When Rosenberg first met Eckart, he allegedly asked, "Can you use a fighter against Jerusalem?" Eckart, a key early promoter of Hitler, certainly could. Rosenberg quickly became a contributor to Eckart's political magazine, In Good German. It was in the 8th issue of this magazine that Rosenberg's first article against Bolshevism appeared, The Russo-Jewish Revolution. This essay, which Rosenberg reprinted 4 times, established the core theme of his thought for years, the assertion that Bolshevism was Jewish. He generalized this view in a worldwide conspiracy, political, financial, and racial, aimed against defeated Germany. Rosenberg cemented his place by succeeding Eckhart as editor of the Nazi newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, Ethnic Nationalist Observer, in 1923, after working for it since 1921. Through this platform, Rosenberg relentlessly disseminated his beliefs in a vast Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. He authored tracts such as The Tracks of the Jew Through the Ages and Immorality in the Talmud, both 1919, and The Crime of Freemasonry, 1921. Most pivotally, Rosenberg was one of the main disseminators of the forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which he used to demonstrate the persistence of the Jewish world conspiracy in current events. His continuing conspiracy tales fueled the vicious streak in National Socialist anti-Semitism. He possessed a strange kind of intellectual influence over Hitler. Some accounts suggest that Rosenberg was the one who helped convince Hitler that communism posed a serious threat to Germany. Rosenberg's obsession with Jewish Bolshevism became an ideological target for Nazism in the early 1920s. According to some historians, Rosenberg played a key role in developing Hitler's belief in Jewish conspiracies by introducing him to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In November 1923, Rosenberg actively participated in the abortive beer hall putsch. When Hitler was imprisoned for treason, Rosenberg, whom Hitler privately considered weak and lazy, was appointed by the leader as the interim head of the Nazi movement, a role he struggled to fulfill amidst intense infighting. This period marked an essential phase where Rosenberg began to provide more theoretical leadership. He returned to his writing, and from this period of struggle and reflection emerged his defining colossal achievement, Der Mythos des 20. Jahrhunderts, the myth of the 20th century. The work was elaborated in its current form by the middle of 1928, and it appeared in the autumn of 1930. Rosenberg conceived of it as a logical outcome of the situation of struggle, a necessary antidote to the edifice of thought that had to be destroyed, providing a concrete interpretation of Europe's past and present. He saw his vocation as becoming the custodian of the party ideology and the author of a magnum opus that would provide National Socialism with a definitive theory of history as a function of race. The book was conceived as a sequel to Houston Stewart Chamberlain's The Foundations of the 19th Century, whose work praised Teutons as the creators of civilization and attacked Jews as disruptive and degenerate. Rosenberg's subtitle captured its essence, an assessment of the soul-spiritual shaping struggles of our time. At the heart of the myth lay the belief that the German nation must not perish and needed ground and soil for future generations, and this land had to be conquered in Europe, specifically in the East. The whole of history was presented as the dramatic struggle of enemy racial souls. Rosenberg's myth was the myth of the blood, the awakening of the soul of the race, which under the sign of the swastika put an end to racial chaos. It postulated that human culture, history, values, art, and even scientific inquiry were determined by race. He erected a human racial ladder based on his Nordic theory. At the pinnacle stood the Aryan race, or Nordic peoples, possessing mystical soul and power, destined for world domination. At the bottom were blacks and Jews. The Aryan culture was defined by innate moral sensibility and an energetic will to power. Opposing this was the Jewish race, the anti-race, Gegenrasse, whose Semitic influences had corrupted modern culture, creating degenerate art, moral, and social degradation. The purpose of the new ideology was to purify the race soul by eliminating non-Aryan elements, in much the same ruthless and uncompromising way in which a surgeon would cut a cancer from a diseased body. Rosenberg's radical views extended to religion. Raised a Lutheran, he fiercely rejected negative Christianity. He argued that the central supreme values of the Roman and Protestant churches hindered the organic powers of the Nordic race and must yield to a Germanic Christendom. His quarrel with Christianity was fundamental. He viewed it as deeply rooted in Jewish character traits. He believed Jesus was a great man, a hero, but that his teachings had been corrupted and subverted by the clever Jew, Paul of Tarsus. St. Paul, in Rosenberg's view, universalized the religion, ignoring aristocracy and race, and creating a mechanism for worldwide domination based on Levantine Etruscan superstitions. In place of the Christian cross, Rosenberg envisioned placing Mein Kampf on altars as the most sacred book. Despite its obscure, rambling prose, which Hitler called stuff nobody can understand, and Goebbels termed philosophical belching, the myth sold over 500,000 copies by the end of 1936 and exceeded 1 million copies by 1942. Its sales surpassed Mein Kampf until Hitler's work was widely distributed. Whether or not people fully grasped its philosophical depths, it established Rosenberg's reputation as the Nazi movement's guardian of Weltanschauung, worldview. In 1937, Hitler awarded Rosenberg the newly instituted National Prize for Art and Science for laying the scientific and intuitive foundation for National Socialist philosophy. Rosenberg himself noted that in every bookstore his writings stood next to the Führer's work, and in the cornerstone of the gigantic Congress Hall being built in Nuremberg, Mein Kampf and the myth were bricked in for all time. With Hitler's accession to power in 1933, Rosenberg finally received official recognition, though he remained an outsider in the rough-and-tumble world of Nazi political power. He was named head of the Party Foreign Affairs Department, APA, in April 1933, and shortly thereafter was appointed a Reichsleiter, the second highest political rank in the party. His career trajectory was marked by grand titles and frustrating lack of executive power. His ambition for higher office was perpetually undercut by his rivals, stemming from his Baltic origins, his introverted temperament, and his image as an inept administrator. Hitler, though loyal to this old comrade, often kept Rosenberg from positions of genuine executive authority. The APA, for instance, was nominally responsible for fascist parties abroad and played a role in Nazi intrigue globally. Rosenberg, together with Admiral Raeder, was even one of the originators of the plan for attacking Norway, having conferred with Vidkun Quisling as early as June 1939 to facilitate the German invasion. Yet his attempts to influence actual foreign policy often failed, notably his amateurish diplomatic mission to Britain in 1933. His influence here was curtailed by the more ambitious Joachim von Ribbentrop. On January 27, 1934, Rosenberg received his most illustrious, yet bureaucratically complex title, the Führer's Delegate for the supervision of the entire intellectual and ideological education and instruction of the NSDAP. This role formed the core of the sprawling bureaucracy known informally as the Amt Rosenberg, Rosenberg Office. It was a monumental task, encompassing the ideological education and training of virtually every echelon of the party. Rosenberg saw this task as crucial. Whether National Socialism would endure or be buried with our fighting ancestors depended on the outcome of these ideological efforts. He envisioned integrating political religion, morality, art, science, and philosophy into a new unity under the National Socialist idea. His involvement in cultural policy escalated drastically leading up to the war. In 1929, he established the Militant League for German Culture, tasked with rooting out degenerate modern art and promoting authentic expressions of German cultural life. A key stepping stone came in 1938 with Hitler's approval of the Hohe Schule, Advanced School of the NSDAP. This Center for Ideological and Educational Research was intended to train the future Nazi elite in racist ideology. The Hohe Schule provided the ideological rationale for institutionalized cultural looting. In 1940, Rosenberg established the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, or Reichsleiter Rosenberg Task Force. This organization was devoted to the systematic appropriation and theft of cultural property across occupied Europe. The ERR's initial mission was to collect materials, especially Jewish artifacts, for the planned research institutes of the Hohe Schule, such as the Institute for Research on the Jewish Question, established in Frankfurt. The ERR became infamous for its operations in France, Belgium, and Holland, systematically confiscating art collections, archives, and libraries, particularly from Jewish families like the Rothschilds and Paul Rosenberg, as well as property belonging to Freemasons. Rosenberg boasted that by January 1941, art, objects valued at 1 billion Reichsmarks, had been sequestered from France alone. The scale of the theft was staggering. In an operation known as Action M, Mobile or Operation Furniture, instituted at Rosenberg's suggestion, 69,619 Jewish homes were plundered in the West, 38,000 in Paris alone, requiring 26,984 railroad cars to transport the confiscated furnishings to Germany. By July 1944, the ERR had seized over 21,903 art objects in the West, including famous paintings and museum pieces. Though Rosenberg envisioned this loot serving his academic research institutes, the property frequently ended up filling the private collections of powerful rivals like Hermann Göring. The year 1941 marked Rosenberg's great hour, bringing his ideological obsessions face to face with executive power, ultimately leading to his deepest involvement in the gravest crimes of the regime. With the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler needed a political authority for the conquered East. Rosenberg's background as a Baltic German with first-hand, albeit skewed, experience of the Russian Revolution, combined with his unrelenting anti-communism, gave him an air of authority in Hitler's eyes. On April 2, 1941, Rosenberg had a conversation with the Führer, a moment he deemed so critical that he chose a dramatic opening for his diary entry. "Rosenberg, now your great hour has come." He was appointed Commissioner for the Central Control of Questions connected with the East European region on April 20, 1941, and less than a month after Operation Barbarossa began, Hitler appointed him Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, Reich Ministerium für die besetzten Ostgebiete, RMFDBO, on July 17, 1941. His ministerial realm was planned to stretch from the former Polish border to the Ural Mountains, encompassing territories that were home to roughly 30 million people. Before taking office, Rosenberg helped formulate the administrative framework for the East, collaborating with high Reich authorities, including Keitel, Jodl, Raeder, Göring, Funk, and Ribbentrop. This planning, conducted over 3 months, aimed at the destruction and partition of the Soviet state and the conversion of territories into German colonies. His plans outlined the carving up of the Ostgebiete, Eastern Territories, into 4 massive regions known as Reichskommissariats: Ostland, Baltic countries and Belarus; Ukraine, Caucasian, Caucasus area; and Moscovian, Moscow region. Only Ostland, under Heinrich Lohse, and Ukraine, under Erich Koch, were fully established. Rosenberg intended his administration to serve two overriding goals: securing German food supply and the war economy, and liberating Germany forever from the pressure from the East. He envisioned the Germanization of racially suitable elements, colonization by Germanic races, and the banishment of undesirable elements. He promoted the idea of creating buffer satellite states, Greater Finland, Baltica, Ukraine, and Caucasus, as a counterbalance to Russia. He viewed the Slavs, though considered lesser than Germans, as Aryan, and sometimes advocated for collaboration with them against Bolshevism. He considered Estonians and Latvians the most valuable nationalities in the East and proposed their evacuation to Germany if the front collapsed. However, the administration of the East rapidly devolved into chaos and violence, far exceeding Rosenberg's control. His authority was constantly undermined by rivals. Hitler placed stakes on force and violence, authorizing Himmler for police authority and Goering for economic exploitation. Rosenberg found his nominal subordinates, such as Erich Koch in Ukraine, acting with considerable independence, usurping his power. Hitler insisted that all decrees were merely theory and that only Germans could bear arms. Rosenberg's initial plans to win over non-Jewish populations with land reform were instantly undermined by Goering, who insisted on exploitation and the retention of collective farms. The Ostministerium was denied authority over the powerful SS and other security formations. The territory under Rosenberg's ministerial authority quickly became a central stage for the Holocaust. Rosenberg bore major personal responsibility for the formulation and execution of occupation policies, including Germanization, exploitation, forced labor, and the extermination of Jews and political opponents. Rosenberg, a firm believer in the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, openly targeted indigenous Jews and Soviet elites for destruction. Even before the invasion, Rosenberg's preparatory instructions mentioned the need for a general treatment for the Jewish problem, involving forced labor for the Jews, creation of ghettos, etc. Critically, the guidelines developed by his office in the spring of 1941 reflected a disturbing pragmatism, projecting that the Jewish question could be solved by giving free rein to the population for some time after the occupation, expecting large-scale Jewish pogroms and murders of communist functionaries. The German task was merely to leave the reckoning with the Bolshevist Jewish oppressors in the hands of the population itself in the initial phase. The occupied Soviet Union became the first region to see the final solution of the Jewish question carried out through the systematic mass murder of Jewish men, women, and children. By the end of 1941, over 500,000 Jews had been annihilated. Estonia, part of his Reichskommissariat Ostland, was the first German-occupied region declared to be free of Jews. His subordinates, such as Reichskommissar Lohse, issued decrees for the seizure of the entire property of the Jewish population in the Ostland. Rosenberg's ministry played a pivotal central role in the evolution of the final solution, sending two representatives, his deputy Alfred Meyer and Georg Liebrandt, to the notorious Wannsee Conference in January 1942, convened to coordinate the mass murder across German-controlled Europe. The territory he administered was the destination for trains carrying Jews deported from the Reich, where they were immediately killed or exploited in forced labor camps. Despite his deep ideological commitment, Rosenberg attempted to maintain a veneer of political expediency, or tough biological humanism. He sometimes complained to Hitler and Himmler about the excessive brutal treatment of non-Jewish occupied peoples, not out of humanitarian reasons, but because the harshness undermined the war effort and his goal of creating future allies. Rosenberg's preference was to assert his political prerogative, leaving the physical annihilation of the Jews to the SS chief without a fight. His administration facilitated the murderous system by determining who was a Jew, ruling over ghettos and forced labor, and thus causing death for hundreds of thousands. Rosenberg continued to cling to his ideological principles even as the Reich crumbled. In his diaries, recovered decades later, he expressed continuous criticism of opportunistic rivals like Goebbels and Bormann, yet showed a monstrous lack of empathy for human suffering. For example, after the almost total destruction of Hamburg by Allied bombing in 1943, he saw it merely as an opportunity for the fulfillment of his blood and soil concept, a hint from fate not to allow the creation of similar world cities in future. As military defeat loomed, he stressed the importance of the final solution as a means of integrating Europe, proclaiming that the goal was to eradicate this dirt, and confirming that the Jewish question in Europe and in Germany is only solved when there is no longer a single Jew on the European continent. In October 1944, having been constantly sidelined and overruled, Rosenberg submitted a letter of resignation directly to Hitler, which went unanswered. He stayed in office until the end. The curtain finally closed on Alfred Rosenberg's fateful career at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. Captured by Allied troops at the end of the war, he stood trial before the International Military Tribunal, IMT, as a major Nazi war criminal. In the courtroom, Rosenberg appeared a pathetic, broken figure, arguing that his work was merely theoretical, a personal philosophy, and blaming his more successful rivals for the brutalities committed in the East. He was forced to deny influence and disclaim any direct influence on school policies or universities. The prosecution, however, made clear that his philosophical role was central to the entire conspiracy. It was agreed at the trial that Rosenberg had a decisive role in shaping Nazi philosophy and ideology, having developed, disseminated, and exploited the doctrinal techniques of the Nazi conspirators. He was held responsible for contributing materially to the unification of the German people behind the swastika, having provided the impetus and philosophy of National Socialism as the apostle of neo-paganism, the exponent of the drive for Lebensraum, and a most energetic Nazi proponent of anti-Semitism. Rosenberg was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, crimes of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. On the morning of October 16, 1946, Alfred Rosenberg walked to the gallows. When asked if he had any last statement to make, he replied with only one word: no. His execution, it is argued, came as much for what he thought and wrote, his racism and anti-Semitism, as for the administrative crimes he directed. For all his grand titles and voluminous writings, Rosenberg's importance lay in his tragic role as the chief theoretical exponent of an ideology that fueled unimaginable destruction. He was, as one observer put it, a man whose tragedy was that he truly believed in National Socialism. His body was cremated, and the ashes were scattered in the river Isar. Yet the physical evidence of his inner world lingered. His handwritten political diary, covering 1934 to 1944, went missing after the trial, only to be recovered in 2013. These sheets of paper, sometimes written on scrap, filled with frustrated outbursts against rivals and chilling ideological commitment, offer a glimpse into the mind of a leader who helped chart the course toward genocide. In the final assessment, Rosenberg's life stands as a chilling monument to the power of destructive ideas. He was the architect who dedicated his life not to building monuments of stone, but to designing a scaffolding of hate, a framework of racial myth around which the Third Reich built its terrible structures of annihilation. This intricate, often unreadable philosophical system, born of Baltic anxieties and revolutionary fear, was precisely what gave the brutal actions of the Nazi regime their self-justifying and horrific ideological depth.